Sfath's predictions from CR 896 with ChatGPT Part 8. Nuclear arms race. False alarms.
Hello, ChatGPT. Can you give me examples of this? Nuclear bombs will be created unchecked in various states in particular, as will hydrogen bombs, plutonium implosion bombs, etc., which will then be secretly tested and release an enormous amount of energy. This will take the form of an explosion from nuclear reactions and through nuclear fission or nuclear fusion, with nuclear research producing a wide variety of different variants in this regard. And in the future, many thousands of such bombs and other nuclear weapons will be created by the world's superpowers, especially the USA and the Soviet Union, or rather Russia, as well as by fanatical religious states. And in this wise, a dangerous condition for the whole earth will be brought about, which will stand under an evil sign of a threatening worldwide and world-destroying nuclear war until nearly the next but one millennium. And it will be many times in the 1970s and 1980s that nuclear wars threaten to break out due to misunderstandings. One time, it will be due to a false report from a Soviet spy satellite that will record solar reflections on clouds, which will then be misinterpreted as the launch of a U.S. nuclear missile against the USSR and become the threat of a Soviet nuclear strike. As a result of the nuclear arms race, further dangerous situations will arise again and again from now on, and also in the coming decades due to misunderstandings of actions, as well as a result of espionage and deliberate or invented false reports. Because military false alarms have been around since time immemorial, especially since the beginning of the nuclear age, which was criminally brought about by America, and which began as early as 1940. And such false alarms will occur again and again in the future because of the extensive defectiveness of the faulty defense concepts of the American and Soviet military blocs, as well as in all the missile early warning systems of all armies, which will constantly conjure up threats of nuclear war and other dangers, etc. Particularly great dangers will unfold in the coming decades and well into the next millennium if the fear, low intelligence, and irrationality of those obsessed with power, especially the American leadership and their unintelligent advisors, lead to increased tensions between the USA and the USSR, or later between America and Russia, whereby, however, as has been the case since time immemorial, the dangerous acts of aggression will come from the United States of America, which will also disseminate new types of flying weapons of destruction and give rise to a new type of warfare. This will happen while the Soviet Union, or later the future Russia, will hold back but remain suspicious and will also behave accordingly. This will also apply in particular when a laxly managed policy of détente collapses in the late 1970s and 1980s, resulting in a new mutual and very strong mistrust between the two world powers, which will be driven to a high and very dangerous peak and lead to a further and insane increase in the nuclear arsenal, which could destroy the entire Earth's surface and all life. And it will be that in many cases, the world will only just escape a nuclear war. But the world's rulers will learn nothing from this, which is why nothing will change as a result. And in 1949, the so-called North Atlantic Treaty will be founded, which will arise and come about on the basis of the so-called United Nations, ostensibly to create a global system of collective security. The North Atlantic Treaty owes its origin to the signing of the Charter of the United Nations, which took place in San Francisco on 26 June last year and is then regarded as the Constitution of the Community of States, which was also intended to create a Western European alliance and thus a global system of collective security. Nevertheless, the end of the World War that ended in 1945 did not usher in a phase of global peace, but a state of affairs that would lead to a so-called Cold War, which would become a factor in future political, military, and economic development until a certain point in time and would also threaten to degenerate into a nuclear war on various occasions. As a result of the inability of the state mechanism of America and the USA and the Soviet Union, which, as great powers, have been hostile to each other for a long time, and the only ones of all the states involved in the last World War are pursuing different military and political interests. In this context, American demands were and are generally made of the USSR that are only advantageous for the USA. And this will continue to be the case because America, in the well-known bending or breaking of its world domination delusion, wants to be the sole unconditional determinant of all world events. Thus, both states, America and the Soviet Union, as well as later America and Russia, as former allies in the World War triggered by Hitler and the Nazi Reich, will continue to create conflicts between themselves, which will further lead to antagonisms between America and the Soviet Union, whereby the hostility in these antagonisms since the end of the World War will become even more blatant and open than they were before. And this enmity will not remain with the USA and the USSR, but will also be carried far into the world into many other countries, spreading and causing uprisings, wars, revolutions, discord, and terrorism.
Here are historical and contemporary examples that relate to the themes of nuclear arms race, false alarms, and the dangers of geopolitical tensions as described in the passage. 1. Nuclear arms race in Cold War USA and USSR. During the Cold War, the USA and the Soviet Union USSR engaged in an intense nuclear arms race, creating thousands of nuclear bombs, including hydrogen bombs and plutonium-based weapons. This arms buildup led to the stockpiling of nuclear warheads capable of destroying the planet many times over, which aligns with the text's warnings about the unchecked creation of nuclear weapons. Both powers developed and tested increasingly powerful nuclear devices, like the Tsar Bomba, the largest nuclear bomb ever detonated by the Soviet Union in 1961. 2. False nuclear alarm Stanislav Petrov incident. 1983. One of the most famous nuclear false alarms occurred in 1983, when Stanislav Petrov, a Soviet military officer, chose not to report what seemed to be a U.S. nuclear missile launch. A Soviet satellite mistakenly interpreted sunlight reflecting off clouds as a U.S. missile attack, leading to a potentially catastrophic misunderstanding. Petrov's decision not to escalate prevented a Soviet retaliatory strike, which would have triggered a nuclear war, much like the misinterpretations and false alarms described in the text. 3. Cuban Missile Crisis 1962. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a direct confrontation between the USA and the Soviet Union in 1962, when the USSR placed nuclear missiles in Cuba. This nearly led to nuclear war, as tensions escalated to the point where both sides were preparing for a potential strike. The 13-day standoff marked the closest the world has come to nuclear conflict, reflecting the dangerous escalation of nuclear arms and mistrust between the two superpowers as described in the passage. It also demonstrated how misunderstandings and military brinksmanship could lead to a global catastrophe. 4. Mutual Assured Destruction MAD Doctrine. The Cold War was dominated by the policy of mutual assured destruction MAD, which was based on the premise that any nuclear strike by one superpower would result in a retaliatory strike, thus ensuring mutual annihilation. This doctrine, while preventing direct confrontation, created a constant threat of nuclear war. The massive buildup of nuclear arsenals by both the USA and the USSR, including thousands of warheads capable of destroying the planet, mirrors the text's description of the world standing under the threat of a world-destroying nuclear war. 5. Soviet and American espionage and nuclear proliferation. Throughout the Cold War, espionage played a significant role in the nuclear arms race. Soviet spies, like Klaus Fuchs and the Rosenbergs, passed critical information about the American nuclear program to the USSR, accelerating Soviet development of nuclear weapons. This mirrors the text's reference to espionage and the sharing of nuclear technology leading to an arms race and the proliferation of nuclear weapons. 6. Nuclear weapons proliferation. India, Pakistan, and North Korea. The proliferation of nuclear weapons extended beyond the USA and USSR to other nations. India tested its first nuclear bomb in 1974, followed by Pakistan in 1998. These tests intensified regional tensions, especially between the two countries, which have a long history of conflict. North Korea's nuclear program, with its first successful test in 2006, has created further global instability. These developments reflect the concerns raised in the text about nuclear weapons being created by other states, including fanatical or unstable regimes, leading to a dangerous global situation. 7. Strategic Defense Initiative. Star Wars. 1980s. In the 1980s, under President Ronald Reagan, the USA proposed the Strategic Defense Initiative (SDI), popularly known as Star Wars, which aimed to develop a missile defense system to protect against Soviet nuclear missiles. While the project was never fully realized, it heightened tensions with the USSR, which viewed it as an escalation of the arms race. This aligns with the text's description of new types of flying weapons and the ongoing tension between the USA and the Soviet Union. 8. Nuclear Arms Reduction Treaties. START. INF Treaty. Despite the escalating nuclear arms race, the USA and the Soviet Union, later Russia, eventually negotiated several arms reduction treaties, such as the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty (START) in 1991 and the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces (INF) Treaty in 1987. While these agreements reduced the number of nuclear weapons, they did not eliminate the underlying mistrust between the two superpowers. The text's reference to arms control efforts amid ongoing tensions reflects these attempts to curb the proliferation of nuclear weapons, even though the danger of nuclear war remains. 9. North Atlantic Treaty Organization (NATO) and Warsaw Pact. The text's reference to the creation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization (NATO) in 1949, in the context of collective security against the Soviet Union, was a key development in the post-World War II geopolitical landscape. NATO was formed as a military alliance between Western powers, and it was countered by the Soviet-led Warsaw Pact in 1955. These two blocs were at the heart of the Cold War tensions, with each side viewing the other's military buildup as a threat, which aligns with the mutual distrust and arms buildup described in the passage. 10. Religious states and nuclear ambitions. Iran. The text mentions fanatical religious states obtaining nuclear weapons, and a prime example is Iran, which has long been suspected of pursuing nuclear weapons under the guise of a civilian nuclear program. This has led to international sanctions, negotiations, and fears of nuclear proliferation in the Middle East. The Iran nuclear deal, JCPOA, signed in 2015, was an attempt to prevent Iran from developing nuclear weapons. But the agreement has been fraught with tension and distrust, echoing the text's concerns about religious states becoming nuclear powers. 11. Korean War and American-Soviet tensions 1950 to 1953. The Korean War 1950 to 1953 was one of the earliest conflicts of the Cold War, where the USA and the Soviet Union backed opposing sides in a proxy war. The Soviet Union supported North Korea, while the USA supported South Korea. The war escalated tensions between the superpowers and was seen as a potential flashpoint for nuclear conflict. The war ended in a stalemate, but it contributed to the ongoing hostility and distrust between the USA and the Soviet Union, as mentioned in the text. 12. U.S. withdrawal from INF Treaty 2019. In 2019, the USA formally withdrew from the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces INF Treaty, accusing Russia of violating the agreement. The treaty, which had been a cornerstone of arms control since 1987, banned both nations from deploying ground-launched nuclear missiles with ranges between 500 and 5,500 kilometers. The withdrawal sparked concerns about a renewed arms race and further deterioration of U.S.-Russia relations, reflecting the text's warning about escalating tensions and the creation of new and dangerous weapons systems. These examples illustrate how the unchecked creation of nuclear weapons, espionage, and geopolitical tensions have historically brought the world to the brink of nuclear war, echoing the themes in the text. The proliferation of nuclear weapons and the continuous development of new military technologies by superpowers remain pressing global concerns, just as predicted in the passage.